Power and corruption have always been among the most destructive forces in human history, and when they come together without resistance, they can lead to unspeakable cruelty. The story of the plantation owner, breeding his blind daughter with 11 slaves, is one of those horrifying reminders of what happens when morality is consumed by the hunger for dominance and control. It is not just a story about an individual act of evil, but a reflection of how systems built on power and exploitation twist the human spirit beyond recognition. When a man holds absolute control over others without accountability, he begins to believe that his desires define what is right and wrong, and that belief is the seed of all corruption. The plantation owner lived in a world that gave him godlike authority over other human beings. His wealth, his land, and his skin color became his identity and his justification to command life and death. He grew up in a system that told him he was superior, and that others existed only to serve his will. That kind of belief does not merely shape behavior, it reshapes the soul. It removes empathy. It numbs conscience. And it turns the human heart into something hollow. The corruption of the soul begins quietly. It begins when a man learns to justify cruelty with logic and convinces himself that his actions are necessary or even noble. The plantation owner likely thought he was pursuing strength or legacy or some perverse form of progress. But what he was really doing was feeding the dark emptiness within himself. The blindness of his daughter could have been seen as a moment for compassion, a reason to protect and love more deeply, but instead, it became another tool in his pursuit of power. In his mind, everything he owned existed to serve his vision, even if that vision was monstrous. He saw people as objects and their suffering as irrelevant. He bred human beings as if they were animals and forced his own daughter into a nightmare she could not even see. The blindness that shielded her eyes from the horror could not shield her soul from it. This is what corruption looks like when it is fully grown. It does not appear with fire or chaos at first. It grows quietly within the heart of a man who has forgotten that others feel pain just as he does. He convinces himself that his authority makes him right. And the more power he holds, the more blind he becomes to the destruction he creates. Power without accountability is a disease, and like any disease, it spreads. It infects everyone around it. The slaves on the plantation did not only suffer physically, they suffered mentally, spiritually, and generationally. Every act of dominance became a message of hopelessness, a reminder that their lives were not their own. The plantation owner's power was not just physical, it was psychological. He controlled every breath they took and every future they could imagine. This kind of control destroys both the oppressor and the oppressed, because while the enslaved were stripped of their humanity, the master was stripped of his soul. Power twisted him until he could no longer tell the difference between creation and destruction. He saw control as love, domination as success, and obedience as proof of worth. When corruption reaches this level, it no longer feels like evil to the one committing it. It becomes ordinary. It becomes routine. The plantation owner probably saw himself as a man of vision, as someone shaping destiny rather than destroying it. This is the most dangerous form of power because it hides beneath the illusion of purpose. When cruelty becomes normalized, the truth is buried, and generations live under its shadow. That is what happened in the world of slavery. Of powerful justified their brutality with religion, with economy, with tradition, but all of those were lies designed to protect their own comfort. The plantation owner was a product of that lie, but he also became its most horrifying example. His actions did not just scar the people he enslaved, they corrupted the land itself. The soil that was watered by sweat and blood carried the memory of those crimes. Power and corruption do not fade when the act ends. They echo. They linger. They haunt every generation that came after, carried the weight of what happened on that plantation. The community, the region, the entire history of that place was poisoned by one man's belief that he could play God. That is the ultimate lesson of corruption. Once it takes root, it spreads beyond the individual. It infects everything around it. In a deeper sense, power reveals the true nature of a person. A good man, when given power, becomes a protector. A corrupt man, when given power, becomes a destroyer. The plantation owner's corruption did not start when he bred his daughter with slaves. It started the moment he believed that he was above other human beings. The system of slavery gave him the permission and the tools to act on that belief. And once he did, there was no turning back. His moral decay was complete, and the result was suffering beyond measure. He destroyed lives, families, and generations. He turned something sacred into something monstrous. He created life only to taint it with horror. In the end, power and corruption always collapse under their own weight. Evil can build kingdoms, but it cannot sustain them. The plantation owner's story ends as all such stories do, in decay and destruction. His name may fade from memory, but the pain he caused does not. The echoes of his actions live on in the collective memory of a people who endured the unimaginable. His legacy is not one of greatness, but of warning. It teaches that unchecked power is the breeding ground of inhumanity, and that once corruption consumes the heart, it turns every act of creation into destruction. When we look back at this story, we are forced to confront the truth that evil does not always come with fire and rage. Sometimes it comes in the form of a man who simply believes he has the right to do whatever he pleases. That belief is the core of corruption. It is the quiet justification that leads to the loudest tragedies. And as long as humans crave power without conscience, the same story will repeat, in different forms across different times. The plantation owner may be gone, but the idea that power can exist without morality still lingers in the world. That is why this story matters. It is not just history, it is a mirror. It shows us what happens when the human soul bows to the hunger for control and forgets the sanctity of life. Dehumanization and control are two forces that have shaped some of the darkest chapters in human history. When people are stripped of their identity and treated as objects, the natural boundaries of morality collapse. And the result is horror beyond imagination. The story of the plantation owner who bred his blind daughter with 11 slaves is one of those chilling reflections of what happens when a human being sees others not as people but as property. It reveals how the desire to dominate can corrupt the essence of humanity and how control over others can transform a person into something monstrous. When power turns people into tools, every action becomes a violation of the human soul, and every life involved becomes a vessel for suffering. The enslaved men on that plantation were not seen as fathers, brothers, or sons. They were reduced to instruments of a master's twisted experiment. Their names did not matter. Their emotions did not matter. Their pain did not matter. They were born into a system designed to erase their humanity from the moment they took their first breath. That is the essence of dehumanization. It begins when a society convinces itself that one group of people is less than another. And once that belief takes root, it grows like a disease. The plantation owner had complete control over the lives of his slaves, and that control became his identity. It defined his worth, his authority, his pride. In his eyes, these men were not human beings with hearts that could feel or minds that could think. They were property resources to be used and discarded. Dehumanization requires repetition. It needs a culture that supports it and a system that enforces it. The world that allowed slavery did exactly that. It created laws that stripped people of rights, traditions that justified ownership, and religions that distorted truth to protect cruelty. The plantation owner was both a product and an enforcer of that system. He did not see his actions as evil because he had been raised in a world where evil was dressed as order. The act of breeding his blind daughter with the enslaved men was not just an individual act of madness. It was the ultimate expression of control. He wanted to prove that his authority extended beyond life itself, that even creation and birth could be shaped by his will. The blind daughter in this story was both victim and symbol. She was blind to the horror, but she was also bound by her father's control. Her blindness became the master's excuse, his justification for manipulation. He believed that because she could not see, she could not resist, and because she could not resist, he had the right to use her. This is what happens when control becomes absolute. It strips away not only the freedom of the oppressed, but also the humanity of those who are supposed to be loved. The daughter's condition could have inspired compassion, but in the mind of a man obsessed with dominance, it became another opportunity. to assert power. That is the sickness of dehumanization. It does not stop at one victim. It spreads to everyone around until no relationship remains. Pure control over others changes the person who wields it. It begins with small justifications, perhaps, a command, a punishment, a lie told to maintain order. But with time, those small acts of control evolve into cruelty. The plantation owner's authority was unchecked, and that kind of power breeds delusion. He believed he could shape destiny and bend nature to his desire. He used the bodies of his slaves and the body of his daughter as if they were raw materials for his own experiment. His actions were not driven by necessity but by obsession. He wanted to test the limits of his power to see how far he could go before the world stopped him. But the world did not stop him because the world around him was built to protect men like him. That is how control becomes unbreakable. It is supported by silence and fear. The enslaved men had no voice. They were forced to obey even when obedience meant the destruction of their own dignity. Every order, every threat, every act of violence reinforced their helplessness. When a man is forced to submit long enough, he begins to forget his own worth. That is the deepest wound of dehumanization. It kills the spirit before it kills the body. The plantation owner's power was not just in his physical control, but in his ability to destroy hope. He made his victims feel that their suffering was inevitable, and that no one would ever see them as more than tools. That is the cruelty of control. It convinces the oppressed that resistance is useless. But even in that darkness, the truth remains that no amount of control can erase humanity completely. The slaves still felt pain, still dreamed, still remembered their names and families, even if they were not allowed to speak them. The plantation owner may have believed he had total control, but what he created instead was a legacy of horror. His attempt to play God only revealed his emptiness. His soul was consumed by the very power he worshipped. He could command bodies, but not love. He could create life, but not meaning. He built his authority on fear, and fear can never sustain. A world for long dehumanization also has consequences that extend far beyond its victims. It poisons the society that allows it. It teaches generations to value control over compassion and hierarchy over justice. When children grow up watching others treated as less than human, they learn that cruelty is normal. That is how evil becomes tradition. The plantation system thrived because control was passed down like inheritance. The sons of masters became new masters. The slaves' suffering became ordinary, and the humanity of all involved eroded over time. The Plantation Owners Act was only the most extreme expression of what that system always intended: complete dominance over every aspect of life, in every corner of history, where control has replaced empathy. The result has been destruction. The plantation owner's story is not unique. It is part of a long pattern that repeats whenever power goes unchecked. His control destroyed his daughter's innocence and the slave's dignity, but it also destroyed his own soul. He thought he was creating something powerful, but he only created pain. The thing that was born from that horror did not just destroy Carolina. It destroyed any illusion that such a system could survive without consequence. When control becomes absolute, the system collapses because it cannot sustain the weight of its own cruelty. True control is an illusion. No man can truly own another. No master can rewrite the truth of human worth. The plantation owners' world crumbled because it was built on lies. Lies that justified domination. Lies that erased empathy. Lies that said one man could possess another. But truth always resurfaces even from the darkest soil. The people who were enslaved carried that truth within them. The memory of their suffering became the foundation for resistance, and the echo of their pain became a warning for generations. Dehumanization and control are not relics of the past. They are dangers that still exist in different forms today. Whenever one person believes they have the right to dictate the life of another, the same darkness begins to stir. It may not wear the same face, but it carries the same hunger for power. The story of the plantation owner is a reflection of what happens when that hunger is left unchallenged. It reminds us that to see another human being as less is to destroy the very meaning of being human. The more control one seeks over others, the less control one has over their own humanity. And in the end, that loss is the most devastating destruction of all. The legacy of horror that followed the actions of the plantation owner was more than the aftermath of a single evil act. It was the birth of a curse that stretched across generations, leaving scars too deep for time to heal. When something is created, through cruelty it carries that darkness within it forever. The plantation owner who bred his blind daughter with 11 slaves did not just destroy lives in that moment. He infected the land, the blood and the memory of an entire people with the consequences of his monstrous decisions. What was born from that act was not a child of love or hope. It was a symbol of suffering, a reflection of the corruption that had taken root in the heart of a world built on oppression. That legacy did not, and when the plantation burned or when the people were freed, it lived on in silence and fear, in the unspoken pain that lingered through generations. Horror leaves a shadow that moves through time. It does not fade simply because the people who caused it are gone. The plantation owner's actions turned Carolina into a place where the soil itself remembered screams. Every tree, every wall, every room carried the weight of what happened there. The enslaved people who were forced into that nightmare carried their trauma in their bones and passed it down to their children even if they never spoke of it. That is how the legacy of horror works. It hides in stories half told. It moves through families as quiet grief. It shapes how people see themselves and how they see the world. It becomes part of identity without permission. The children of those enslaved men grew up in a world that treated their existence as proof of shame, while the descendants of the master grew up surrounded by wealth built on blood, both sides haunted by a truth that could not be erased. The plantation itself stood as a monument to that horror. A place where humanity had been sold and experimented upon could never return to innocence. It became a site of whispers, and decay people avoided it because they felt the weight of what had been done there. It was said that strange things happened in that region, but the real haunting was not supernatural. It was historical. It was the invisible inheritance of trauma passed through memory and silence. The horror that had destroyed Carolina was not a monster lurking in the dark. It was the truth of what people are capable of when power and cruelty are allowed to rule. The legacy of that act stretched beyond the plantation system. It shaped the culture of fear and prejudice that lived long after slavery ended. The descendants of the enslaved carried the pain of being treated as less than human, while the descendants of the powerful carried the burden of denial. Both were victims of the same horror, one through suffering and the other through guilt. The land of Carolina became a living reminder that no society built on exploitation can escape its consequences. Every injustice leaves echoes that return in new forms. The violence that once happened in the open continued in silence through inequality, through poverty, through hatred disguised as order. When the plantation owner forced his will upon those he enslaved, he believed that he was creating something powerful, something that would prove his control over nature. But what he created instead was a legacy that consumed everything around it. The child born of such an act could not symbolize hope because it was born of coercion and cruelty. It was the living embodiment of everything wrong with that world, and the community knew it. The horror that followed was not just moral but physical, as disease, decay, and madness spread through those who remained. The land itself seemed to reject what had been done upon it. Crops failed, families fled, and the plantation that once stood as a symbol of wealth turned into a place of ruin. The destruction of Carolina was not caused by rebellion or revenge, but by the natural decay of a world poisoned by sin. What makes the legacy of horror so powerful is that it does not need to be remembered in detail to exist. The silence that follows an atrocity becomes its own kind of curse. When people refuse to speak of what happened, the truth seeps into the ground and into the bloodline. The descendants of those who suffered on that plantation may never have known the full story, but they felt it in their lives. They felt it in the fear passed down by their parents, in the caution in their voices, in the unspoken warnings not to trust the powerful. The descendants of the master felt it too. though they hid it behind pride and wealth. They inherited the unease that comes from knowing something is wrong but refusing to face it. That is the true horror of legacy. It traps everyone in its web. The destruction of Carolina was not only physical, it was spiritual. The act of dehumanization and control had ripped apart the moral fabric of that world, and when the foundation of a society is built, on cruelty it cannot stand. The people of that region lived among ghosts not of the dead but of their own actions. Every song, every story, every shadow carried the echoes of that evil. The fields that once bloomed with life grew silent. The laughter that once filled the air turned into whispers. The horror did not vanish, it simply changed shape, transforming into shame, fear, and brokenness. The plantation owner had long since died, but his sin lived on in the suffering of those who came after. Generational trauma is not something that time heals easily. It becomes part of the collective consciousness. The people of Carolina grew up with stories of curses and hauntings because they needed a way to explain the weight they felt, even when they could not name it. The horror that destroyed the region was not the result of superstition but of history, trying to force itself to be remembered. A land built on pain cannot find peace until truth is spoken and forgiveness sought. The plantation owner had thought himself powerful, but the legacy he left behind proved that power built on cruelty always turns against itself. His descendants inherited wealth but not peace, while the descendants of the enslaved inherited pain, but not defeat. Both carried the same wound carved into the heart of the same land over time. The story became legend distorted by fear and silence. Some said the child that was born brought a curse. Others said the family line itself was doomed. But the real curse was not magical, it was moral. It was the unhealed wound of injustice that festered in the shadows of history. The people who lived in Carolina could not escape it because it was not outside of them. It was within them, passed down in the way they treated each other, in the mistrust and the division. The horror that had once been confined to a single plantation had infected an entire region. Even centuries later, the air of that place would feel heavy, not because of ghosts, but because of memory. History does not disappear. It waits. It waits for someone to tell it truthfully, to break the silence, to cleanse the wound. But as long as people look away, the horror lives on in quiet forms, in prejudice, in fear, in inequality. The plantation owner believed he could create something lasting, and he was right. But what lasted was not his legacy of greatness. It was his legacy of destruction. The story of what was born and how it destroyed Carolina is not just a tale of one man's cruelty. It is a reflection of what happens when humanity loses itself, when people forget the value of life and allow evil to rule in silence. They build monuments of pain that last longer than stone. The horror lives on, not in the child, not in the land, but in the lesson. It carries power used without conscience will always turn creation into destruction, and what begins with control always ends with ruin.